What if I told you there was once a kingdom so powerful, it shattered bronze weapons like pottery, yet today its name is all but forgotten? How could an empire this mighty, built on secret technologies and unmatched military prowess, vanish from the pages of history? Story of the Hittites. In the heart of ancient Anatolia, hidden deep in the rugged Pontic mountains, a forgotten civilization once ruled with an iron fist. But what happened to the Hittites? What caused their empire to collapse so suddenly? And why, despite their dominance, did they leave only ruins behind? Is the story of the Hittites, an empire that rose from obscurity, conquered vast territories, and built an empire stretching from the Black Sea to the borders of Egypt. Yet, despite their staggering technological advancements like the secret of iron smelting, their name has faded into obscurity. So how did a civilization so advanced, so powerful, disappear into the mists of time? Join me as we uncover the hidden history of the Hittites, exploring their brilliant rise, mysterious fall, and the secrets that still lie buried in the ruins of their ancient cities. If you enjoy uncovering hidden histories like the one we're diving into today, I'd love to hear why you haven't hit that subscribe button. Drop a comment below and let me know. We're all about exploring history together, and I want you to be part of this journey. A huge thank you to all our amazing subscribers. You're the reason we keep bringing these stories to life. And for everyone else, tell me, where are you watching from? I want to hear from you. Let's start a conversation. Comment below, and let's keep unraveling history. What if I told you there was a civilization so advanced, it could destroy its enemies without ever having to draw a sword? A kingdom that held the secret to iron, and yet was undone by the very technology it used to dominate the ancient world? Welcome to the story of the Hittites, a civilization that disappeared so completely, history almost forgot it ever existed. Long before the Iron Age, the Hittites were already wielding weapons that could shatter bronze armor like pottery. But how did a small nomadic tribe from the harsh Anatolian highlands discover iron smelting centuries before the rest of the world? Their secret? It wasn't just metallurgy. The Hittites had perfected a process so advanced, their weapons could slice through anything that stood in their way. For centuries they kept this iron monopoly under lock and key, and the world's greatest empires trembled at the thought of it. But what if I told you their downfall was caused by that very power, by the dangers of holding an uncontested weapon of destruction? This wasn't just a secret about weapons. The real tragedy of the Hittites wasn't just that they were conquered, it's that they built their empire on a weapon they couldn't control. But that's only the beginning. In the 17th century BC, a new power emerged from the forgotten valleys of Anatolia. Led by a king who didn't just conquer, he absorbed. Laban's Hittite Empire wasn't just military genius. It was cultural assimilation on a scale the ancient world had never seen. But what if I told you that Laban wasn't just a conqueror, he was a visionary who foresaw his empire's demise, and still pushed forward? Laban's chariots, armed with iron, could cut through enemy forces like paper. But the Hittites weren't just warriors, they were diplomats, masters of forging alliances, creating the first known peace treaty between an empire and a pharaoh. Yet, despite all their diplomatic brilliance, the one thing they couldn't do was prevent the deep cracks that formed within their own empire. What happens when a king builds an empire based on the very thing he can't control? And more importantly, what happens when his own people can no longer trust him? The Hittite Empire didn't fall because of a foreign invasion. It fell because of the one thing every empire fears: internal division. While the Hittites were fighting enemies on every front, something far worse was happening behind their walls. Political corruption, instability within the royal family, and a religious shift that alienated their people all contributed to their slow collapse. What if I told you that their downfall didn't come from their external enemies, but from their own arrogance? The same technological superiority that made them feared across the ancient world left them vulnerable to a threat they couldn't anticipate. The Hittites were about to face their greatest enemy, one that could not be fought with iron. But what was this invisible force that crushed them from within? Then came the Sea Peoples. Unknown, unstoppable, and utterly devastating. These mysterious raiders from across the sea appeared like ghosts, striking at Hittite cities and disappearing without a trace. The Hittites, masters of the land, were helpless in the face of a threat they could neither understand nor defeat. But what if the Sea Peoples weren't the only reason the Hittites fell? What if their inability to adapt to new kinds of warfare was what truly doomed them? And why didn't their iron weapons save them from these seafaring invaders? The Sea Peoples didn't just invade, they shattered the very foundation of the Hittite Empire. But there's more to their story. And their arrival was only the beginning of the Hittites' unraveling. By the 12th century BC, the Hittite capital of Hadassah was abandoned. The empire that had once stretched from the Black Sea to Egypt was reduced to dust, leaving no trace of its grandeur. The final blow wasn't just an invasion. It was the culmination of 1,000 mistakes, 1,000 small betrayals, and a kingdom too proud to acknowledge its own vulnerabilities. What did the fall of the Hittites truly mean? It meant that power, no matter how advanced, cannot survive without balance. The Hittites were too far ahead of their time in iron and warfare, but fell short when it came to governance, adaptation, and internal unity. But the Hittite story doesn't end in ruins. Their legacy still survives today, buried beneath the rubble of time. And as we dig deeper into their forgotten history, we discover that the Hittites may have influenced far more than we ever imagined. For centuries the world forgot the Hittites. But in the early 20th century, a breakthrough in archaeology brought their story back to life. In the ruins of Hadassah, archaeologists unearthed cuneiform tablets that revealed a civilization lost to time. And as we decode these ancient records, we realize that the Hittites were not just conquerors, they were a bridge between worlds. The Hittites' legacy is all around us, hidden in the foundation of the Iron Age, in the diplomatic treaties that shaped the ancient world, and in the very iron that sparked an industrial revolution centuries before the Industrial Age. But the real question remains: could the Hittites have ever survived the internal strife and external invasions? And if so, what could they have become? The Hittites left behind a legacy both grand and tragic. A civilization that wielded iron as its greatest weapon, and its greatest downfall. Their story is one of ambition, innovation, and an ultimately failed pursuit of immortality. But as we uncover more about their rise and fall, we realize their influence on the ancient world was far greater than we ever knew. What's the true cost of being too advanced for your time? The Hittites were not just an empire, they were a warning to all who would follow. They wielded iron like no one else in the ancient world. Their weapons could cut through bronze armor as if it were cloth. And yet, the world almost forgot them. How does a civilization with such unimaginable power simply vanish, leaving only whispers behind? The Hittites were not born conquerors. They were smiths, artisans in the shadows of the Pontic Mountains, guarding a secret so powerful that it sent tremors through the ancient world. Their secret? Iron. But iron wasn't just a weapon. It was a technological leap that, if properly harnessed, could obliterate the world's greatest empires. And the Hittites had mastered it centuries before anyone else. The secret of iron wasn't discovered by a single mind, but by an entire culture dedicated to this craft. Theirs was a monopoly that was more than just military superiority, it was a weapon of psychological terror. The fact that they could craft tools that sliced through bronze like butter terrified even the most powerful kingdoms in Egypt and Mesopotamia. But why? What did the Hittites know that the world feared? But their iron was not their true power. What if the real force behind their rise was something far more insidious? Something no one saw coming? By the 17th century BC, the Hittites weren't just smiths, they were warriors, diplomats, and conquerors. With their mastery of iron, they expanded their borders from the Anatolian plateau to the edges of Mesopotamia. But the real question isn't how they conquered, it's what they left in their wake. Laban, the first great king of the Hittites, wasn't just a military genius, he was a visionary who fused cultures and technologies into an empire that seemed invincible. But what Laban failed to see was that his greatest strength, his iron-wielding chariots, was also his greatest weakness. The Hittites' greatest triumphs were sealed not just in battle, but in diplomacy. They signed the first-ever international peace treaty with Egypt. But the shock came when, despite their military genius, this same diplomacy led to their collapse. Could it be that diplomacy, something the Hittites were celebrated for, became their undoing? What does this teach us about the fragility of power? How could diplomacy, the very tool that helped build their empire, have simultaneously set the stage for their destruction? And why did the Hittites, an empire that mastered iron, fail to hold on to it? The Hittites were a kingdom forged in iron, but even iron can rust. Their greatest strength, their iron monopoly, was also a source of corruption, internal strife, and division. Their technology was no longer enough to keep the empire together. Political infighting, religious transformation, and leadership failures began to take their toll. While Egypt and Mesopotamia focused on external threats, the Hittites were being undone by internal weakness. Dynastic struggles tore apart the royal family. The once unified empire fractured into factions. But how did a kingdom built on technological innovation fail to adapt? What happened to the iron that once made them mighty? Could the Hittites have survived if they had embraced change? And if so, why didn't they? The answer lies in their internal collapse and in one single event that no one predicted. It wasn't foreign kings or gods that brought down the Hittites. It was a force so unpredictable, so mysterious, it was like a storm from the sea. The Sea Peoples. These raiders from the sea struck at the heart of the Hittite Empire, bypassing the iron defenses that had once been impenetrable. But the real shock is this: no one knows where the Sea Peoples came from. Were they invaders? Refugees? And why did their attacks cripple the once unstoppable Hittite military machine? The Hittites had a weapon so advanced it made them unbeatable. And yet, this unknown enemy shattered everything. How could the mighty Hittites fall to an enemy they could never see coming? And why did their collapse only accelerate once the Sea Peoples arrived? The Sea Peoples weren't the only cause of the Hittites' fall. Their internal fractures, exposed by their failure to adapt to changing warfare, became their ultimate undoing. In the end, it was not just foreign invaders that destroyed them, but their own inability to change course. By the 12th century BC, the Hittites abandoned their once proud capital, Hattusa. But what was left behind wasn't just rubble, it was a revelation. The Hittites had been consumed by their own contradictions. They had the technology to destroy bronze weapons, but they couldn't destroy their own internal corruption. The very empire that had ruled with iron couldn't survive it. What does this mean for empires today? When a civilization crumbles from within, does technology just become a tool for its own destruction? The story of the Hittites is more than ancient history. It's a warning. And their secrets have only begun to reveal themselves. After centuries of silence, the Hittites were rediscovered. The world learned that their iron was not just a weapon of war, it was the cornerstone of the Iron Age. Their diplomatic prowess, their cultural fusion, their military innovation, all were waiting to be unlocked. But even now, the question remains: why did their empire disappear so completely? It wasn't until 1906 that archaeologists unearthed the treasures of Hattusa, key to understanding the Hittites. But there's a shocking truth hidden in those ruins. Their collapse may have been foretold long before the Sea Peoples arrived. What does it mean for us today when an empire falls? And could it be that the lessons of the Hittites hidden beneath the earth are still waiting to be understood? Perhaps they've been teaching us all along. The Hittites were not conquerors by birth, they were invaders from the unknown steppes of Central Asia. What if I told you their story isn't just one of rise and fall but a collapse so spectacular, it reshaped the destiny of entire civilizations? More than 3,500 years ago, the Hittites arrived in Anatolia, not as settlers, but as invaders from the desolate steppes of Central Asia. They weren't born conquerors, they were warriors forced to adapt or die. What most people don't realize is that the Hittites weren't just invaders, they were survivors of a catastrophic environmental and political collapse in their homelands. They fled eastward to Anatolia, where their survival instincts and mastery over horses and iron metallurgy gave them the edge over the established kingdoms. But their greatest strength, iron, was not just a weapon, it was a double-edged sword. Could it be that the very thing that made them powerful also set the stage for their destruction? When the Hittites arrived in Anatolia, they didn't just bring warriors, they brought a game-changing technology, iron. While other civilizations still wielded bronze, the Hittites wielded a material stronger and more dangerous than anything the world had seen before. Their chariot warfare was the most advanced military strategy of the time. Three-man chariots with a driver, archer, and shield-bearer could cut through enemy lines like a scythe through wheat. But the true shock? The Hittites were so secretive about their iron smelting process that their monopoly on iron allowed them to control not just battles, but the fate of entire empires. But iron wasn't the only weapon in their arsenal. Their diplomacy was just as sharp. They made peace with Egypt, an enemy that had previously seen them as a threat. But what if I told you this diplomatic treaty set the stage for a crisis that no one could have predicted? In 1274 BC, the Hittites signed a treaty with Egypt, marking the first known international peace agreement. But what was the true cost of this peace? Did the Hittites sacrifice too much of their power? The treaty with Egypt wasn't just a victory, it was a strategic misstep. In their pursuit of peace, the Hittites weakened their own influence, allowing Egypt to reassert dominance in the region. The treaty, hailed as a diplomatic triumph, ironically set in motion the events that would later unravel Hittite power. But the most shocking part? Internal division was already eating away at the empire. Could this early peace treaty have unknowingly allowed for their own political disintegration? While the Hittites dealt with internal instability, something far more dangerous was emerging on the horizon: the Sea Peoples. They came from nowhere, raiders so destructive that they would bring down not just the Hittites but the entire Bronze Age. The Sea Peoples were an enigma, no one knows where they came from. But one thing is certain: their raids decimated the Hittite coastline, bypassing iron and chariots, leaving nothing but ruins in their wake. The Hittites couldn't stop them. Why? Because they didn't understand the threat until it was too late. But the Sea Peoples weren't the only ones attacking. Internal strife and economic collapse weakened the empire from within. How did they miss the signs of their impending fall? And could their decline have been avoided? By the 12th century BC, the Hittite Empire was no more. The once mighty kingdom, built on iron and horses, crumbled in the face of both external threats and internal collapse. But the real question isn't how they fell, it's why no one saw it coming. The Hittites' downfall wasn't a single catastrophic event, it was a slow decay of their social fabric. Political infighting, succession crises, and the complete collapse of trade routes left their economy in ruins. But the worst part? Their religious fusion, meant to unite a fractured empire, became a source of division, undermining the very foundation of their rule. How did an empire that conquered so much and once seemed unstoppable disappear from history? And how could the Hittites, masters of iron, diplomacy, and war, fail to adapt to the shifting tides of time? For centuries, the story of the Hittites was buried beneath the rubble of time. It wasn't until the early 20th century that their lost capital, Hattusa, was uncovered, revealing a forgotten empire that had shaped the course of history. The rediscovery of the Hittites wasn't just an archaeological triumph, it was a revelation. Their advanced legal systems, iron technology, and diplomatic ingenuity influenced later empires, but the mystery remains. Why were they forgotten for so long? The rediscovery of the Hittites forces us to question how history is written. How many other lost empires are waiting to be uncovered? And what lessons can we learn from the Hittites' rise, fall, and ultimate disappearance? The Hittites left behind a legacy of innovation, diplomacy, and destruction. Their rise from the steppes to empire was as shocking as their fall, and their disappearance raises more questions than answers. What does the story of the Hittites teach us about the fragility of power? And why does their legacy still haunt us today? What if the greatest weapon a king possessed wasn't iron, but the fear and envy he inspired in the gods themselves? The Hittites' rise wasn't by fate, it was by the blood of their enemies and the sacrifice of their own identity. Their empire wasn't just built on military might, but on a brutal, innovative blending of cultures, and that fusion would tear them apart. The Hittites didn't just stumble upon power, they seized it. Arriving from the desolate steppes of Central Asia, they were nomadic invaders driven by a desire not just to conquer but to adapt. And when they did, they didn't just assimilate, they transformed the ancient world. The Hittites were among the first to exploit iron not just for weapons but for cultural domination. Their use of iron was so revolutionary, it made their enemies' bronze weapons obsolete. But this wasn't just a tactical advantage, it was a symbol of their superiority. But what would you do with the most advanced technology of your time? Would you wage war, or would you find a way to break the old systems and build something completely new? Laban, the king who would push the Hittites beyond their limits, wasn't born into power, he seized it. By the time he took the throne, the Hittites weren't just surviving, they were becoming the rulers of their world. Laban didn't rely on traditional Hittite tactics. He created the three-man chariot crews, the first of their kind, and with that innovation, shattered the expectations of even the mightiest empires. But as Laban's empire grew, so did the mistrust within. Was his genius a gift or a curse? Could a king too powerful ever escape the traps of his own empire? The secret behind Laban's conquests wasn't just the iron, it was his obsession with cultural fusion. Every conquest was an opportunity to learn, to evolve, and to integrate. He didn't just conquer enemies, he absorbed them, reshaped them, and used their power to fuel his own. While other civilizations destroyed their enemies, Laban integrated their technology, culture, and even their gods. The Hittites took Mesopotamian religion, Egyptian siege tactics, and Anatolian myths and melded them into a new identity, one that would be both their greatest strength and fatal weakness. But every empire has a breaking point. What would happen when the fusion of so many different cultures became a disaster waiting to happen? No one saw them coming. The Sea Peoples, an enigmatic force from the seas, struck with such devastating speed, they shattered the Hittite heartland like glass. The Sea Peoples weren't just pirates, they were the end of an era. They destroyed the Hittite coast and ignited the collapse of a once mighty empire. But what no one knows is that these raiders were more than an external threat, they were a reflection of the Hittites' internal rot. But the Sea Peoples weren't the only enemy. The Hittites' greatest enemy was already inside their walls, the cracks in their very identity were already beginning to show. As external threats mounted, something more insidious was happening inside the Hittite kingdom. The fusion of cultures, their attempts to merge religions, and even the gods themselves led to an empire that was culturally unstable, its very foundation torn apart. The Hittites, once feared for their strength, were now lost in a battle of beliefs. The king's inability to maintain his empire's religious identity was the silent killer, a civil war of faiths, politics, and power that made them weak in the face of both the sea peoples and internal revolts. As the last Hittite king sat upon his throne, the end of their empire was already written not in the sword, but in the sands of time. But what was their legacy? Was their rise only a fleeting moment of brilliance, destined to vanish like smoke? The Hittites may have crumbled, but their legacy, their technology, their diplomacy, and their cultural fusion was felt long after their fall. From Iron Age technology to legal systems, their influence lived on in the very civilizations that replaced them. The Iron Revolution they started didn't die with their empire, it spread to the Greeks, the Romans, and beyond. The Hittite peace treaty with Egypt set the stage for diplomacy that would guide ancient foreign policy for centuries. But as we dig deeper into the collapse, one question remains: could the Hittites have survived their own success? Or was the nature of empire itself always doomed to fail? Today the story of the Hittites is largely forgotten. Their cities lie in ruins, their tablets buried, their legacy hidden beneath the sands of time. But in their rise, their fusion of cultures, and their tragic fall, they reveal something profound about power, identity, and the fragility of empires. The Hittites didn't just disappear, they were erased by history itself. Their achievements were so advanced, so dangerous, that later empires didn't want to remember them. The Romans, the Greeks, and even the Egyptians chose to forget what made the Hittites so powerful. In the end, we must ask, how many other empires greater than ours are waiting to be forgotten just as the Hittites were? And what will the next generation say about our legacy? What if I told you the most advanced military force in the ancient world disappeared without a trace? The Hittites, who mastered chariot warfare and iron metallurgy, vanished into history just when their power should have reached its peak. What caused their empire to fall? Was it the sea peoples, or something far more dangerous within? The Hittites didn't just appear out of nowhere. They arrived in the Anatolian plateau as a wave of Indo-European warriors, displaced from their Central Asian steppes. Unlike the established empires of Egypt and Mesopotamia, their power was built not on ancient traditions, but on raw innovation. But how did a tribe of nomads evolve into an empire that threatened the ancient world's most powerful kingdoms? It wasn't just their military innovations. The Hittites rewrote the rules of warfare, blending the fierce traditions of the steppe with the technologies of the ancient world, and they did it with terrifying precision. But what was the cost of this relentless innovation? Were the Hittites, in fact, too reliant on their own technological advantages? Could their greatest strength have been their ultimate downfall? When other empires used foot soldiers, the Hittites used something entirely different: the three-man chariot. Imagine a weapon so efficient that it rendered traditional armies obsolete. The driver steered with incredible speed, the archer struck terror with precision, and the shield-bearer protected them all, faster than any army could respond. The chariot wasn't just a weapon, it was psychological warfare. In less than a minute, the enemy's defenses were shattered, and their army was already in disarray before a single chariot had even made contact. But how did the Hittites train their warriors to master this complex weapon? Was there something deeper, a dark secret, that allowed them to dominate the battlefield with such precision? As the Hittites conquered and absorbed enemies, they didn't just destroy, they integrated. The technology, the gods, and even the very people they conquered became part of their empire. But what happens when an empire loses its identity by absorbing too much? The fusion of Hittite strength and foreign power might have been the key to their rise, but was it also their downfall? The Hittites absorbed the technologies of their enemies and eventually, their gods. This religious shift, this attempt to merge and adapt, caused deep internal strife. Were they really creating a more powerful empire, or did this fusion create a fractured identity that led to their downfall? Could the Hittites have lost their soul in their attempt to become the perfect fusion of military might and cultural diversity? Was their downfall a result of losing themselves in the very act of conquering others? When the Sea Peoples attacked, the Hittites were already fighting multiple battles on several fronts, and yet, these mysterious invaders brought down the empire in a flash. But who were the Sea Peoples really? Were they an external threat, or were they the final warning of the Hittites' internal decay? But the Sea Peoples weren't the only enemy. The Hittites had created enemies from within. Internal rebellions were brewing, and the battle for the throne turned just as brutal as the wars they waged against outside invaders. The Hittites' sudden disappearance from the historical record is one of the greatest mysteries of the ancient world. It's not just that their cities were abandoned. Their metalworking techniques disappeared, their royal records vanished, and their language was lost. How does an empire so advanced, so powerful, just disappear? What if the Hittites' downfall wasn't just the result of external invasion? Could their own innovation, their relentless pursuit of power, have destroyed them? The very tools that made them invincible became the seeds of their cultural collapse. In the end, the Hittites were erased by history, yet their influence lives on in the empires that followed. Could their greatest achievement also have been their greatest mistake? Today, the Hittites are largely forgotten. Their cities are ruins, their language a distant echo, and their chariot forces mere memories. But their influence is written in the bones of history, in the laws they established, the military innovations they birthed, and the empires that would rise to take their place. If you're finding this story fascinating, then don't let it slip away. Pause for a moment, hit that subscribe button, and join us on this journey through the hidden chapters of history. Trust me, you won't want to miss what comes next. And for those of you who are still on the fence, I want to hear from you. Tell me why you haven't subscribed yet in the comments. What are you waiting for? Your voice matters, and I'd love to know your thoughts. To all of our loyal subscribers, thank you. You're part of a growing community that's hungry for history. Let me know where you're watching from, and let's see how far this historical tale reaches. I can't wait to read your comments. Imagine an empire so powerful that the most prized metal in the ancient world became their weapon of choice. Iron, stronger than bronze, yet so carefully guarded, its secret was worth killing for. The Hittites didn't just build an empire, they built a legacy that would terrify Egypt and Mesopotamia. And they did it with a commodity that no one else had until it was too late. Long before iron became a staple of empires, it was a dangerous secret. For the Hittites, this precious metal wasn't just a tool, it was the cornerstone of their rise. By the 14th century BC, the Hittites, who were once mere nomadic invaders, had mastered the art of smelting iron. Their weapons were so strong they could shatter the bronze shields of their enemies. But what made the Hittites so powerful wasn't just their ability to make iron, it was their stranglehold over it. They held the key to the ancient world's most valuable resource, and the entire ancient Near East feared them for it. But how did the Hittites protect this secret? And what happened when other empires began to demand it for themselves? And just when their enemies started catching up, the Hittites began to realize that their iron wealth wasn't just a source of strength, it had made them vulnerable in ways they didn't see coming. The Hittites didn't just control the trade of iron. They controlled the trade routes. Their strategic location in Anatolia placed them at the crossroads of Mesopotamia, Egypt, and the Mediterranean. The Hittites held the purse strings to the entire region's wealth. Everything from gold and timber to luxury goods flowed through their hands. Their ability to command these trade routes turned their kingdom into a bastion of wealth. But trade was also a double-edged sword with so many eyes on them. The Hittites weren't just competitors in the marketplace. They were a target for every other ancient empire. How long could they keep their hold on the ancient world's wealth? before someone came to take it from them. While the Hittites built incredible wealth, a rising tide of enemies lurked, determined to plunder their success. What happened when the lure of iron became too strong for the mighty to ignore? Imagine mountain warriors, once scraping by in the cold, rugged highlands of Anatolia, now rich kings controlling the most valuable resources the ancient world had ever seen. It was an unbelievable rise, but it came with incredible cost. How did the Hittites, a small, isolated people, amass so much wealth so quickly? Their control of iron wasn't just about weapons. It was about influence, alliances, and the economy. The wealth they accumulated allowed them to transform from a small tribe into one of the most powerful empires in the ancient world, but it also made them vulnerable to betrayal. But no empire ever lasts forever. What were the hidden fractures in the Hittite Empire that began to emerge, even as they grew richer? Could the iron monopoly have actually set the stage for their destruction? The Hittites' empire collapsed mysteriously despite their wealth. Was it the pressure of the wealth from iron corrupted them? It made them complacent. Despite being the economic juggernaut of the ancient world, the Hittites faced multiple internal rebellions and external threats that shattered their unity. The very wealth that had built their empire slowly began to unravel it. But what was the final blow? Was it their own greed or something more insidious? What happened when their iron monopoly was challenged by a rising power that sought to destroy them once and for all? The Hittites may have vanished, their empire buried under time, but their legacy, the iron technologies they pioneered, lives on. The empires that followed, including Rome and Greece, learned from their innovations. The secrets of their empire, though lost, still whisper in the ruins they left behind. The question remains, did their obsession with power and wealth ultimately destroy them? Or was it the very trait that made them so mighty that ultimately led to their destruction? The Hittites weren't just conquerors, they were masters of manipulation. But what if the real secret to their power wasn't iron or chariots? What if it was their ability to twist the very soul of the people they conquered, forcing them to worship gods they didn't choose? In the 17th century BC, the Hittites, a small people from the rugged highlands of Anatolia, began their rise to power. Their strength was in iron, their chariots, and their brutal conquest, but their true power lay in something far less visible. The religious syncretism they practiced was not just a blending of gods. It was a form of control, an art of uniting the masses under the banner of their divine rule. But what if the gods they adopted were not unifying their empire but secretly dividing it? How far were the Hittites willing to go to blend faith? And what happened when they crossed a line that even their gods couldn't forgive? In their quest to blend the beliefs of all they conquered, the Hittites may have sparked resistance from a force more powerful than their armies, a rebellion born of faith itself. The Hittites didn't simply adopt the gods of the people they conquered. They made them part of the royal pantheon. They made these gods into a tool of control. But were these gods truly respected by the peoples they ruled, or were they seen as symbols of subjugation? While the Hittites sought peace through religious unity, the very gods they merged might have become agents of division. Some subjects saw the blending of gods as a forced assimilation, not a spiritual union. In some regions, resentment grew as the Hittite gods began to overshadow the local deities' gods that the people had revered for centuries. And as the empire expanded, the Hittites weren't just battling external enemies. They began to face growing internal resistance, not from warriors or kings, but from the very priests who once served their gods. What happens when the religious elite begins to question the authority of the king's faith? The Hittite kings were not only rulers, they were seen as divinely appointed. Their legitimacy rested on the gods' favor, particularly that of Tarhun, their storm god. But they weren't just warriors, they were also spiritual leaders, using religion to solidify their reign. The king's role was to act as the mediator between the gods and the people. But the question remains, did the king's divine right strengthen their empire or expose its weakness? As the Hittites rose to power, they merged gods from other cultures into their divine hierarchy. But what if this divine right wasn't enough? What if the gods they merged together were the cause of their eventual decline? Their vast empire, once united by the gods, began to fragment as the gods themselves became contested. Was the empire's downfall a result of a broken divine pact? The very gods they worshipped may have turned against them, revealing a shocking twist in their quest for domination. By the end of the 13th century BC, the Hittites were in decline. The empire was torn apart by internal strife and external invasions. But what role did their religious policies play in this collapse? Did their attempt to blend gods from every corner of their empire contribute to the dissolution of their unity? The Hittites' belief in their divine right began to fade as their gods were questioned. Their very spiritual system, once the foundation of their power, became a source of conflict. Could a kingdom built on religion crumble when the people no longer believed in their gods? What if the Hittites didn't just lose their empire to invaders? What if they were destroyed from within, by a crisis of faith so deep that no amount of iron or chariots could save them? The Hittites' empire may have vanished, but their religious legacy remains. Their story is a stark reminder that empires are often not destroyed by external forces, but by the very beliefs that hold them together. The Hittites proved that even the most powerful empires, no matter how many gods they worship, are only as strong as the faith that binds them. In the end, the Hittites' empire fell not to an enemy, but to the cracks in their own faith. As their gods became too many, their empire became too fragile. Could the true lesson of the Hittites be that empires like faith are most vulnerable when they try to blend too many worlds? The Hittites weren't just a military powerhouse. They were master architects of society, blending law, religion, and gender roles to create a system so advanced that even their neighbors were terrified of its power. But what if that very progressivism was also their greatest weakness? Around the 16th century BC, the Hittites ruled a vast empire stretching across Anatolia. What set them apart wasn't just their mastery over iron or their fearsome chariots, it was their legal system. Unlike their contemporaries who believed in harsh retribution, the Hittites prioritized compensation. A man who killed an ox didn't face death but compensated with multiple animals. This legal philosophy was groundbreaking. The Hittites' laws were progressive and allowed for the integration of many cultures, as it created a framework for peaceful cohabitation. Unlike the eye for an eye laws of their neighbors, Hittite justice was a reflection of their desire to maintain stability across their diverse empire. But how did a system based on compensation hold together a massive empire? Could this legal flexibility be the reason why they were able to dominate for centuries, or did it create cracks that would eventually unravel their empire from within? What if the Hittites' most progressive law designed to keep peace was the very thing that left them vulnerable to a revolution from within? Let's dive deeper into the social tensions their system might have caused. In a world where women were often chained by patriarchy, the Hittites offered them rights most empires never dared. Women could own property, initiate divorce, and serve as priestesses in temples. This wasn't just a fluke, it was a strategic choice that empowered half of their population in ways that were unimaginable to their enemies. The Hittites didn't just create a legal system, they redefined gender roles. In a time when patriarchy ruled the ancient world, the Hittites treated their women as equal partners in society. But was this equality a sign of progress or a dangerous gamble? As the empire grew, the influence of women in Hittite society became more powerful. But did this empowerment make them a target for those who would see the Hittites' flexibility as a weakness? As the Hittites expanded, their progressive laws began to strain the fabric of their society. While many embraced these reforms, others saw them as threats to the old order. How did a society so advanced in gender equality and legal flexibility face internal pressure? Was the Hittite legal system based on compensation too radical for its own good? Despite their legal innovations, the Hittite Empire faced growing internal resistance. Conservative factions within the empire began to push back against the laws that granted women property rights and divorce. Could a society so progressive be too flexible in a world dominated by traditional patriarchal systems? Could the internal resistance to their legal and social structures eventually tear apart the fabric of Hittite society? Let's explore how this progressive system might have become its greatest enemy. The Hittites' innovations may have been their greatest asset, but also their downfall. As their empire expanded, they came into direct conflict with the more traditional patriarchal systems of their neighbors. The growing conflict between progressive governance and conservative forces began to tear at the seams of the Hittite Empire. As the Hittites grew in power, so did the rivalries with more conservative, patriarchal empires like Egypt and Mesopotamia. Were the Hittites too ahead of their time, creating a society too flexible for its own stability? Their legal system and gender empowerment started to cause internal divisions of fracture that would eventually lead to their collapse. Could the Hittite Empire's internal struggle between progress and tradition have triggered their downfall? Or was their eventual collapse a consequence of their enemies' rigid traditions? Keep watching as we uncover the ultimate crisis that led to the end of the Hittite Empire. The Hittites may have vanished, but their progressive legal system and women's rights left an indelible mark on the ancient world. Their society proved that flexibility and equality weren't just ideals, they were tools of power. But as with all great empires, their strengths eventually became their weaknesses, and the Hittites' progressive society crumbled under the pressure of its own ideals. The Hittites proved that an empire doesn't just rise through military might, it rises through progress. But the true question remains: can progressive societies survive in a world built on tradition? The Hittites' empire might have collapsed, but their vision for the future still resonates today. What if I told you that the Hittite Empire, one of the most advanced civilizations in the ancient world, was destroyed not by invading armies, but by a betrayal that no one saw coming? A betrayal so hidden that thousands of years later, their empire is little more than a shadow on the map. How did the once mighty Hittites go from forging the most feared weapons of the ancient world to disappearing almost entirely? In the mid-16th century BC, the Hittites rose from the rugged, mountainous heart of Anatolia, bringing with them something that would change the ancient world forever: iron. While Egypt and Mesopotamia fought with bronze, the Hittites were secretly creating the hardest metal known to man. Their weapons were so advanced they could shatter bronze like pottery. The Iron Age was born in their furnaces. But here's the catch: the Hittites didn't just conquer, they absorbed. They didn't impose their ways, they became cultural chameleons, fusing their iron weapons with the gods and beliefs of the civilizations they conquered. By the time their empire was at its peak, they had not only mastered military technology, they had mastered the art of blending cultures. But here's the twist: despite their brilliant military and cultural strategy, the Hittites' greatest strength would become their weakness. Their downfall wasn't just from external forces, it was internally engineered. But how did this happen? Was it arrogance, betrayal, or something darker? When Laban ascended the throne, he envisioned a kingdom spanning from the Mediterranean to the Euphrates. But as his empire grew, so did his internal conflicts. More territory meant more provinces to govern, and as the empire expanded, the Hittite kings found themselves stretched too thin, relying more on local lords than centralized control. This reliance would prove to be their undoing. Laban's successors, men like Mursili II, who should have been the heirs of a glorious kingdom, soon found themselves trapped in a web of political alliances, revolts, and foreign intrigues. There was one thing Laban never accounted for: greed. His empire's wealth, fueled by their monopoly on iron, made them a target for both internal coups and foreign powers. As the Hittites grew stronger, so did the number of enemies within. Power struggles erupted not just in the courts, but across their vast territory. Who could they trust? And would the empire break apart before its enemies even arrived? The Hittite Empire, though revered for its military prowess, was falling apart from within. Internal power struggles were like poison in the bloodstream, slowly eroding their unity. While they focused on conquering more land, they ignored the rising tension from within their own ranks. And in a twist of fate, their iron monopoly, which once seemed invincible, now became the root of division. The Hittites had created empires within their own empire, city-states that operated almost independently, each with their own leaders, wealth, and agendas. The Hittite capital, Hattusa, grew weaker as rival factions began to fight for dominance. Rebellions across the empire fed off the internal turmoil, and just when the Hittite kings thought they had achieved stability, they found themselves battling an unseen force: disintegration from the inside. How far can an empire go when trust is no longer the foundation? What happens when the center cannot hold and everyone is fighting for themselves? The final blows to the Hittite Empire came not in the form of military defeat, but through economic instability and the decay of their political system. By the 12th century BC, foreign invaders, the Sea Peoples, took advantage of the cracks in Hittite defense. But by then the empire had already been weakened by revolts, weak leadership, and internal corruption. What most don't know about the fall of the Hittites is that, years before the Sea Peoples, the empire was already crumbling from within. Political factions in Hattusa, desperate to control the iron trade, opened their gates to the enemy, and foreign alliances replaced loyalty to the throne. Were the Sea Peoples just the final nail in the coffin? Or did the Hittites' failure to adapt to the changing world seal their fate long before they even came knocking? By 1180 BC, the Hittite Empire ceased to exist. Their cities were abandoned, their iron monopoly lost to time, and their once mighty army fell apart. The Hittites, who had once threatened Egypt and Mesopotamia, were now only ghosts in the annals of history. But the Hittites didn't completely vanish. Their technological innovations, especially their ironworking techniques, lived on and influenced the rise of Iron Age empires centuries later. And despite their fall, the cultural influence they had over their conquered regions would be felt long after their collapse. As the Hittites disappeared, their secrets didn't die with them. Instead, they were absorbed into the civilizations they once controlled. But did the world learn from the Hittites' mistakes? Could their rise and fall be the very story of every empire that followed? The Hittites were an empire built on iron, but ultimately their ambition shattered them. Their story is a haunting reminder of the dangers of overreach, internal disunity, and the collapse of once great powers. What lessons can we take from them, and why is their legacy more relevant today than ever before? The Hittites' downfall wasn't just a fall from power, it was a collapse of an entire way of life. From iron mastery to political fragmentation, their story echoes through time. But have we truly learned the lessons they left behind? Or are we, like them, heading toward a fate we cannot see coming? In the heart of Anatolia, the once indomitable Hittite Empire, forged in the fires of iron and blood, crumbled not from a lack of strength, but from a fatal flaw they never saw coming: an enemy from the sea. And it wasn't the Egyptians, nor the Assyrians who ended their reign. It was the Sea Peoples. The year is 1200 BC, and the Hittite Empire is at its zenith. Iron weapons in hand, their chariots dominate the battlefield. But deep within their heartland, the seeds of their destruction are quietly growing. With vast territories stretching from the Mediterranean to the Euphrates, their power seems unshakable, yet their empire is about to be confronted by a force they never considered: the Sea Peoples. By 1300 BC, the Hittites controlled one of the largest empires in the ancient world. Their armies wielded iron, a material so advanced it broke through bronze armor like paper. With their three-man chariots, driver, archer, and shield-bearer, Hittite forces were nearly unstoppable on land. They dominated the Anatolian plateau, imposing their will from the heart of modern Turkey all the way to the edges of Mesopotamia. But for all their military superiority, the Hittites' biggest weakness wasn't on land. It came from the seas, where they were entirely unprepared. The Sea Peoples, no one really knows who they were. Some say they came from the Aegean, others from the western Mediterranean. What we do know is that they came in fleets of swift, deadly ships, striking the coastlines of great empires, and the Hittites, despite their iron might, had no answer to this new kind of warfare. Unlike the kings of Mesopotamia or Egypt, who had established empires with strong borders, the Hittites relied on their land-based power. The Sea Peoples didn't respect borders; they created their own chaos on the water. Their raids were swift and merciless, and once they set their sights on the Hittite coast, everything would change. Could the Sea Peoples have been the ultimate predators? Did they just see an opportunity, or was there something more sinister in their raids? As their empire expanded, the Hittites faced internal power struggles, military overreach, and growing discontent. The land was too vast to control, and many conquered peoples began to revolt. Internal power struggles and rebellious provinces weakened the core of the empire. But it wasn't just the Sea Peoples or the internal strife that weakened them. The Hittite military, once unstoppable, was now paralyzed by a force they couldn't counter. Ships, carrying fire and destruction, struck where they could not reach. How could such a mighty empire, with their dominance of iron and chariot warfare, fail to anticipate an enemy from beyond the shore? The Sea People's surprise attacks triggered the collapse of Hittite coastal cities. Troy, Ugarit, and other coastal cities succumbed to these marauders. The once invulnerable Hittite ports were overrun, and their iron monopoly lost its power. The riches of the empire began to dry up, and the once great empire fractured. The Sea Peoples didn't just attack; they disrupted trade, shattered morale, and left behind cities in ruins. And even as the Sea Peoples ravaged the coasts, their power wasn't just felt at the water's edge. They were part of a larger, unfolding collapse of the entire Bronze Age. But why did the Hittites, despite their advances, never see it coming? The Hittite Empire fell not only because of military overextension or a naval weakness, but because they had overestimated their power. Their failure to adapt to the unpredictable forces of the Sea Peoples ultimately led to their downfall. The collapse of the Hittites wasn't a single battle lost. It was the unraveling of an entire empire, toppled by forces far outside their control. And yet, some historians argue, was it truly the Sea Peoples that destroyed the Hittites, or did their internal struggles and lack of foresight bring them down long before the ships arrived? Was the Sea Peoples' invasion the final blow, or just the beginning of an even greater transformation that would rewrite the history of the ancient Mediterranean? In the blink of an eye, the mighty Hittite Empire, a civilization that had conquered, adapted, and thrived, was reduced to nothing. What was once a kingdom that spanned from the Black Sea to Mesopotamia fell, not to invaders but from within. The greatest mystery? The final blow came from a force they never expected. At the height of its power, the Hittite Empire controlled the trade routes that connected the Mediterranean to the Black Sea. But despite their overwhelming military might and technological advantage, the Hittites had a monopoly on iron. The empire's greatest strength became its greatest weakness. Iron weapons that once sliced through bronze in battle couldn't protect the Hittite Empire from its internal rifts. Civil wars, power struggles, and the death of the leadership structure plunged the once mighty empire into chaos. What happened to the Hittites was not a story of foreign conquest. It was a story of systemic collapse. But what could have led to the implosion of a civilization so advanced? Could the decay have been inevitable, or was there one single misstep that caused it all to fall apart? As the empire unraveled from the inside, one fateful decision made by their final rulers would seal their fate. But what was that decision? Could the collapse of Hadassah, their great capital, have been prevented if one king had made a different choice? The Hittite Empire, built on conquest and iron technology, began to rot at the core during the reign of Tudhaliya IV. After decades of military conquest and expansion, the internal pressures were too much for a fragmented leadership to manage. Tudhaliya's weak leadership and the failure to secure a stable succession sparked civil wars, forcing the empire into a state of chaos. Unlike previous kings, Tudhaliya IV failed to balance military dominance with effective governance. Power was increasingly concentrated in the hands of regional leaders, and soon, rebellion was no longer an exception, but the norm. But was it the failure of leadership alone that led to this collapse? Internal rebellions were exacerbated by another devastating weakness. The people were starting to lose faith in their kingdom's unity. Was the empire's end written into the fabric of its military system all along? Had the Hittites become too accustomed to victory to recognize the signs of vulnerability? Was Tudhaliya IV's reign really the cause of the downfall, or was there a deeper, unseen force working from the inside out to tear the empire apart? At the same time that internal strife ravaged the Hittites, a new mystery emerged. The Sea Peoples, a mysterious, unknown force from the sea, began to raid the coastal regions of the Hittite Empire. These raiders were unlike anything the Hittites had faced before. Their tactics and speed overwhelmed even the most advanced iron weapons of the Hittite military. Despite their technological supremacy, the Hittites were unable to defend their coastal cities from the fast-moving Sea Peoples, who would leave nothing but ruins in their wake. The Sea Peoples were the first true test of the empire's ability to defend its coastline, and they failed miserably. How could the mighty Hittites, masters of iron, conquerors of vast lands, be defeated by a force of mystery and chaos? What secrets do the Sea Peoples hide that made them nearly unstoppable? The Sea Peoples didn't just destroy Hittite cities, they exposed a massive vulnerability in the empire's defense strategy. But the final blow to the empire wasn't just external. There were signs of decay already in the capital Hadassah that would seal the Hittites' fate. By 1178 BC, the Hittite capital of Hadassah was abandoned, marking the end of an empire that had lasted centuries. The fall of Hadassah was not just the loss of a city, it was the loss of everything the Hittites had worked for. Power, wealth, and military superiority had once flowed through its gates. Now it stood empty, a shell of what it once was. Hadassah's fall was the final chapter of the Hittite story. The city that had witnessed the greatness of the Hittite kings and the innovation of their armies was left to crumble in the face of rebellion and the retreat of its people. Could Hadassah's fall have been avoided? Was the collapse really inevitable? Or was it a result of poor leadership, military overreach, and enemies exploiting the empire's weakness? The fall of the capital seemed like the end. But the legacy of the Hittites wasn't completely wiped out. Their iron technology, legal systems, and cultural blending left marks on history that would last beyond the ruins of Hadassah. Could the Hittite spirit live on even as their empire fell? Though the Hittite Empire was lost to history, their advancements in iron weaponry, trade routes, and legal systems influenced the next great powers of the Near East. Assyria, Babylon, and even Egypt would inherit parts of Hittite culture, spreading their innovations far and wide. The Hittite script, military innovations, and legal systems survived through their successors, influencing the rise of future civilizations. The collapse wasn't the end of their legacy, it was the beginning of their cultural imprint on the ancient world. The Hittites might have fallen, but their fingerprints were all over the civilizations that would rise in their wake. Could the powerful influence of a once great empire still be felt today, even though their cities are no more? As we look back at the rise and fall of the Hittite Empire, one question remains. Could they have avoided the inevitable collapse, or was it simply too late to save a civilization that had stretched itself too thin? What if the greatest power in the ancient world, an empire that ruled with unmatched innovation, was wiped from history by a single force no one saw coming? The Hittites were not born from conquest, they were forged by it. Emerging from the rugged highlands of Anatolia, they discovered iron, a weapon that could shatter bronze and change the course of warfare forever. By the 16th century BC, the Hittites had perfected the use of iron, producing weapons that gave them dominion over their enemies, including Mesopotamian giants and Egyptian pharaohs. But there was more at play than just weapons. The Hittites knew that true power lay in the control of resources, not just military might. And so, they took control of one of the most valuable commodities of the ancient world: iron. How did a people from the steppes, lacking great cities or monumental landmarks, come to dominate trade routes from the Mediterranean to the Black Sea? The secret lies within their innovative fusion of cultures, but did this fusion also sow the seeds of their downfall? By 1300 BC, the Hittites ruled a vast empire stretching across Anatolia and into Mesopotamia. Their strength was in adaptation. They didn't simply conquer, they integrated the people they conquered into their empire. Through religious syncretism, they blended their own beliefs with those of the Anatolian and Mesopotamian peoples. They incorporated foreign gods into their pantheon, creating an empire that transcended ethnic boundaries. But as the empire grew, the question remained: could this delicate balance of religion, politics, and military strength hold up against the internal and external forces at play? They built an empire on integration and adaptability, but as they expanded, cracks began to form. Could their innovative approach be their undoing? By the late 12th century BC, the Hittite Empire faced a new threat: the Sea Peoples, mysterious invaders from the sea, who devastated coastal regions and cut the Hittites off from their vital trade routes. The Sea Peoples' raids were the final blow to an empire already weakened by internal power struggles and military overreach. Could the collapse of the Hittites have been caused by a threat they never anticipated? Their iron weapons and advanced tactics couldn't stop an enemy that struck from beyond the reach of their armies. And yet, as the Sea Peoples ravaged the coast, a far more destructive force lurked within the Hittite Empire itself. Would the Hittites survive, or would their empire fall apart from within? In the final years of the 12th century BC, the Hittites were facing multiple threats. Rebellions in their provinces and power struggles at the royal court left their empire fractured. Hadassah, their royal city, once a beacon of power, was abandoned, its great walls left to crumble as the empire collapsed under its own weight. Could an empire so advanced, so rich in resources and culture, really disappear so quickly? The truth behind their fall is one of the greatest mysteries of the ancient world. The Hittites were gone, their capital left in ruins. But their legacy would rise from the ashes through the discovery of ancient texts. The world would slowly begin to unravel their lost history. In the early 20th century, archaeologists uncovered the cuneiform tablets that revealed the Hittite language, their legal systems, and their cultural innovations. These texts painted a picture of a civilization far ahead of its time. The rediscovery of the Hittites' iron technology and legal codes has reshaped our understanding of the ancient world. They weren't just conquerors, they were pioneers shaping the future of the ancient Mediterranean. What more can we learn from these ancient texts? What secrets remain hidden beneath the surface of their once great empire? In the end, the Hittites may have fallen, but their story lives on. Their legacy is not just one of military conquest, but one of innovation, integration, and resilience. How will the world continue to uncover their impact? The Hittites were more than just a lost civilization, they were the architects of change, the silent shapers of the ancient world's future. Their story is not just about a lost empire, but about how civilizations rise, fall, and leave echoes that last forever. In the heart of Anatolia, a forgotten civilization once ruled with the power of iron, diplomacy, and unmatched military strategy. But in the blink of an eye, it vanished. What caused this empire's meteoric rise and shocking fall? The answer lies buried beneath the rubble of their abandoned cities and in the secrets they left behind. Hittites were not simply conquerors. They were the architects of a technological revolution. Their mastery of iron was not just an advantage, it was an empire-defining game-changer. At a time when the world relied on bronze, the Hittites created weapons that could cut through their enemies like a hot knife through butter. But their true strength lay not just in warfare, it was their adaptability and cultural fusion. The question isn't just how they conquered, but why their technology gave them such a massive edge over the other great powers of the time. The secret to their success was simple yet profound. They were the first civilization to master the art of forging iron weapons. With iron, their armies didn't just fight, they dominated. From swords to plows, iron was the backbone of their power. The Hittites' monopoly on iron extended to the point where other empires, including the Egyptians, were forced to either trade with them or suffer crippling military disadvantages. What many don't know is that the Hittites kept their ironworking methods so secret that even when they were at their peak, other civilizations were still using bronze weapons. But this technological mastery came with a heavy price. The very secret that made them powerful also made them vulnerable. What happens when your most valuable asset becomes the target of everyone around you? While other civilizations fought and destroyed, the Hittites created lasting peace. They were pioneers of diplomacy, cementing alliances through marriage, trade, and treaties that lasted for centuries. The Hittite peace treaty with Egypt, signed after the Battle of Kadesh, is one of the first known peace agreements in history, predating modern diplomatic practices by thousands of years. Their diplomatic prowess wasn't limited to treaties, they also mastered the art of religious syncretism, incorporating foreign gods into their pantheon, a strategy that unified a fragmented empire. But was their reliance on diplomacy their greatest strength or their fatal flaw? Could it be that their diplomatic ties would end up being their undoing? For all their advances, the Hittites weren't immune to the pressures that tear at all empires. Internal strife, factionalism, and rebellion began to eat away at the empire's core. By the time of the empire's collapse, Hittite records show a fractured monarchy, power struggles within the royal family, and discontent among their conquered people. Despite their military and diplomatic genius, the Hittites were often undermined by their own elite factions within the royal family and the aristocracy who fought each other for control of the throne. But the real threat wasn't just internal, it was a looming disaster from the sea. What was the real cause of their collapse? And could it have been avoided if they had made different choices? The Sea Peoples were a mysterious group of raiders from distant lands who struck fear into the hearts of the greatest powers in the ancient world. With their swift, unpredictable attacks, they tore through the Hittite coast and overwhelmed their once secure cities. The Sea Peoples' raids, combined with internal collapse, were the death knell for the Hittite Empire. Despite their iron weaponry, the Hittites were ill-prepared for an enemy they couldn't fight on land. But the Sea Peoples weren't just raiders, they were a symptom of a larger crisis. Could this invasion have been avoided, or was it an inevitable end for the Hittite Empire? Though the Hittites vanished, their legacy never truly died. Their innovations in ironworking spread across the ancient world, influencing the rise of Greece, Rome, and even the later civilizations of the Near East. From the iron weapons that would arm the Romans to the diplomatic treaties that laid the groundwork for modern international relations, the Hittites left an indelible mark on history. In fact, some of the very gods the Hittites worshipped and integrated into their empire would be adopted by other civilizations, showing how their cultural fusion would survive long after their empire's collapse. But did the Hittites ever truly fall, or did their influence simply evolve into something more enduring, more pervasive than anyone could have predicted? The Hittites may have crumbled, but they've never truly disappeared. Their story, filled with ambition, technological brilliance, and cultural ingenuity, is just beginning to be fully understood. From their iron weapons to their diplomatic treaties, their legacy has shaped the world in ways we've only started to recognize. And as new archaeological discoveries continue to emerge, we may still be on the brink of uncovering even more about this lost civilization. If you're fascinated by the story of the Hittites and their incredible legacy, let us know what surprised you the most in the comments below. Was it their revolutionary ironworking, their diplomatic brilliance, or the mysterious sea peoples? Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more untold stories from history's forgotten empires. Join us as we uncover the secrets of the past, because the greatest stories have yet to be told. Hit that bell icon so you never miss an episode.